this is Jessica Garrett Mills again, and today I'm going to talk to you about brain chemicals for motivation for distance learners. A lot of us are wondering how we can better motivate our students who are working at a distance. This is particularly challenging, and I think knowing a little bit about neurochemistry can kind of change your perspective on that and give you a new way of thinking about it. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, brain chemicals and motivation for distance learners. This is the brain. The brain runs on chemicals called neurotransmitters. And for me, thinking about how these neurotransmitters are working within the brain and the nervous tissue around the body is interesting when we think about how to motivate our students. First, just a teeny tiny bit of background info on neurons and neurotransmitters. So this is a picture representing a bunch of neurons. They communicate with one another not by touching, but by getting really, really close and then sending chemical messages back and forth across the gap. So here's a picture, a drawing of the gap, and these vesicles of green balls on the left side, they get a message from the neuron, and they get very, very close to the tip of this synapse of the neuron here, and they release. The vesicle opens up and releases these neurotransmitters into the synaptic gap. And then those neurotransmitters travel across this very, very wafer-thin gap and bind to receptors on the next neuron. And this is how all communication happens within the brain. Neurochemicals are the messengers that deliver all messages in nervous tissue. So with that in mind, there are several neurotransmitters that regulate motivation. In some ways, writ large, we could say almost all neurotransmitters regulate motivation. Motivation is the name of the game here. We're motivated to go find food so that we don't die. We're motivated to go find water. We're motivated to procreate. We're motivated, like motivation is the stuff of life. But there are 5 neurotransmitters that I'm going to talk about today, and I'm going to focus mostly on dopamine, but I'll touch on serotonin, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and oxytocin. So this is a pretty picture of dopamine. A lot of people call dopamine the pleasure neurotransmitter, but that's not exactly right. There was this experiment that'll give you a sense of what dopamine really does for us. In this experiment, monkeys were trained that when a signal came on, they had to do some small task. They had to do some work. It was pretty boring, doing a little puzzle. And then when they did that work, they got a reward. Okay, so signal comes on, it was a light comes on, they do some work, they get a reward. And if dopamine was a pleasure chemical, then what we would see is that dopamine would spike right around when the monkey got the reward. But in fact, what the scientists found was that at the signal, once the light came on, that's when dopamine spiked, and that dopamine remained high until the work was done. So in fact, dopamine is not a pleasure chemical. It's a motivation chemical in the brain. In fact, it's the major motivating force in the brain. So monkey gets a signal, it's time to do the work. The dopamine rises until they can complete the work, and then they get the reward. Dopamine supports this monkey's work habits. It supports their ability to stay focused and be motivated through the end of the work so that they can get the reward. So let's imagine that the signal is now a teacher saying, there will be a paper due at the end of the week. In the brain of a neurotypical student, dopamine then spikes and supports them through doing the work, all the steps of doing the paper, and then falls off when they turn in the paper, and maybe a week or 2 later, they get the reward of a grade. Okay. Now, in an ADHD student, this spike looks much different. ADHD in a lot of students looks like decreased dopamine. So they just don't have this spike. Maybe they have a little bit of a bump. They get the signal, they feel a little bit of urgency, they feel a little bit of motivation, but not enough to actually get the work done in some cases, or not enough to support them in doing the work easily. So So less available dopamine means that a student with ADHD is less motivated to get that reward, or they're less motivated to get the work done, and therefore they don't get the feedback loop of getting the reward. So the student learns that over time, well, the teacher tells me what the assignment is. I struggle to do the work. Maybe I don't do the work. Maybe I do the work and I don't turn it in, and therefore I don't really get the reward. And they don't get that feedback loop that a normal neurotypical student might get. It's not about how much they think they should. It's not about how much they want it. It's just that they don't have the supporting neurochemistry to help them mount their motivating forces and get the work done. The mountain they are climbing is much higher, those with ADHD or with a lack of executive functioning skills and a lack of that dopamine support. These students, it's not an excuse. They still have to figure out how to climb that mountain. It's just helpful to remember that it's much harder for them and they don't have the natural motivating support. A lot of times I have parents say, like, why can't they just do it? Just do that 15-minute assignment and be done with it. And I hear teachers say this too. And the thing is, they don't have that dopamine saying like, okay, let's do it. Let's go find that food pellet. Let's go do that math homework. Let's just get it over with. And then you get the reward. Students with ADHD have not had this feedback loop, and they do not have the same level of dopamine to help support them in doing these tasks. Most of our stimulant medications for ADHD, what they act on is dopamine. So they increase the amount of available dopamine in the brain. So what we're doing is we're raising the student's level of dopamine to that of closer to a neurotypical student. Erica is an IS at the high school in Upper Arlington, and she asked how to motivate a 10th grader with ADHD. She says he has executive functioning and written expression goals. He knows some organizational strategies. He even likes Google Keep when she does it with him, but he forgets to use it at home, or he just isn't motivated to do so. And he doesn't check his email at home, so it's really challenging to support him at a distance. Because of all this, he's missing a lot of assignments. He's probably getting further behind. He's probably getting more and more overwhelmed, though I'm editorializing there at the end. So for a student like this, I would start with major structural supports. And it sounds like Erica is already on top of that. But I would also think about stoking dopamine for a student like this. It sounds like he is struggling to mount the resources to hear the signal. It's the start of the day. It's time for me to get out my Google Keep. It's time for me to work on a daily itinerary. And it's just like, he feels a slight rise in dopamine perhaps, but not enough to be motivated to get the job done. As an aside, a student like this, to me, to my ears, it sounds like he's under-medicated. But I know that's complicated. And so we can think about how to stoke that dopamine in more intervention tool strategy wise, as opposed to the medication angle. I think you could ask that student or the parent when they feel like they're at their best. If he is medicated, you could say, when is that medication supporting you most fully? And maybe you could time the planning session for then. I also think you could use that information to figure out when he might be most able to do hard tasks that otherwise kind of are too difficult for him. Anyway, back to dopamine. Okay, so what can we do to stoke dopamine in a student like this, or any student who's struggling to be motivated at home? Number one, we can celebrate and share teeny tiny accomplishments. So we're reducing, back to this graph, we're reducing the amount of time between signal, work, reward. Signal, he looks at his list, he knows there's a task to do. He does a tiny bit of work, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, and then boom, he gets a reward. I have a tiny visitor. Shut the door.
You gotta help me with something.
Thank you.
Can you close the door?
The laundry.
The other thing that this can do is, it's hard to stay focused with distractions, huh? Okay, so we reduce the interval between signal, work, and reward. We might also really celebrate these accomplishments so that the reward is much more than a neurotypical student would need. Throw a little party, which then strengthens the signal, work, reward feedback loop for that kid. Okay, the next thing we can do is take a big project and break it into tiny pieces and then celebrate each tiny step of the way. So those micro deadlines with a ton of celebration of each success is kind of like tracking tiny accomplishments, but over the long haul. So when we can't reduce the time between signal, work, and reward for the whole project, it's a 2-week project maybe, we can at least do that in baby steps along the way. Okay, we can also do micro deadlines with, again, celebrations for reaching each tiny deadline. So I'm talking about a big project, but we could even think about a daily task as being big for some of these students. So Erica's student who has trouble using Google Keep, every single time he uses it, every time he checks Google Keep, it's a party. If he even has Google Keep open before they have their Zoom meeting, it's like, wow, I can't believe you had it open and ready to go. We celebrate that tiny little effort, and which for him was not a little effort. We celebrate that to close that feedback loop for him. We can help make sure that they're taking care of their bodies through eating, which can increase dopamine. Exercise, which is great for dopamine, is also excellent for serotonin, which we'll get back to in a second. Serotonin is the mood regulating hormone. So if you have a student that's feeling anxious or sad or depressed, exercise is a great recommendation, along with therapy. And sleep. If a student is not on a regular sleep schedule, it's going to mess with their dopamine production. So you can talk to them about, like, what time did you get to bed? You only got 7 hours? Boy, that might not be enough. And students, I mean, we all know last spring, a lot of students practically flipped to nocturnal. And now that students are on a Zoom schedule, I suspect that won't be the case, but I would still be watchful for this. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the other hormones, not going quite as in depth as dopamine, though of course we could talk about dopamine for days and days. Students with anxiety have low levels of serotonin usually. Serotonin is a mood regulating hormone, like I said. The things we can do to help regulate serotonin, of course, SSRIs like Prozac are serotonin regulating medications, but things that we can do are recommend meditation, teach mindfulness, recommend exercise or ask about exercise, getting students out in the sunshine, that increases serotonin, and getting students out in nature increases serotonin. So those brain breaks that I talked about in the other video, those are going to help with serotonin production. Mindfulness, it doesn't have to be hokey, you know, even for teenage boys, if I can get them to take 3 deep breaths. A little mindfulness technique that I can't remember if I taught y'all in the September videos. Hold up your hand, take your thumb, inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. It's 4 deep breaths, and you're counting them by running your thumb up and down your fingers. I like this because students can do it down in their lap. No one has to see it when they're in school, but at home, it doesn't matter if anybody sees it. Okay. Norepinephrine and epinephrine, these are stress hormones. They help us mount the resources to get away from a saber-toothed tiger that's chasing us. Students with ADHD also often show lower levels of norepinephrine, and a lot of our non-stimulant medications act on norepinephrine. What a low level of norepinephrine might mean for a student is they don't feel 2 days before the test that feeling of like, oh shoot, I got to get studying. They might think like, oh, I should study, but they don't have that chemical support, right? They don't have the feeling of urgency until an hour before the test or the night before the test, when things are really down to the wire. And now finally, there's enough of that hormone to be motivating. A lot of my students use procrastination as a tool to mount enough chemical resources in their brain to help them finally be motivated to do something. The challenge with this is it's really like a tightrope walk between enough stress to motivate and too much stress that they tip over the edge into overwhelm. So I try and help students break things into tiny little pieces with hard deadlines so that they feel that pressure coming up against deadlines, but the pressure isn't so big that they can't actually get it done because it's just a baby step deadline along the way. Okay, oxytocin is one of my favorite neurochemicals. It's the cuddle neurochemical. It's also, there is a dark side to oxytocin. It's sort of in group, feeling like you're in the in group. So of course there's an out group, but that's another story for another time. We can stoke oxytocin through touch, through looking at cute things. Cat videos increase oxytocin in the brain. Doing kind things for others. So we can send a text to a friend and check in on how they're doing. Like, good luck on the test. Sending that to a friend increases oxytocin. For us, it probably increases oxytocin for them as well. Walking with a friend at lunch, if that's okay with their parents, that could increase oxytocin. Touch is the main way, but that, in a pandemic, we just don't have that available to us unless we're hugging people in our pod. So instead, we have to find ways to do it across the distance. And there are ways. If a cat video can make us feel good, so can a conversation with a close friend. Okay, so that is a very quick tour of neurochemicals and how they might affect motivation. I really like thinking about motivation through the lens of neurochemicals because it helps me, again, it's not an excuse, but it helps me explain to myself what is going on in the brain of this kid and to strategize by setting up the situation so that we support more dopamine. So we support plenty of oxytocin. So we support serotonin. So we increase norepinephrine, but not so much that it floods a student. We can kind of use these as lenses through which to support our students. If you have more questions about this, please ask. Again, my email address is on that web page. I love geeking out about neurochemistry, so shoot me a question if you've got it. And if I don't know, it gives me an excuse to go find out. Okay, take care, be well, and I will talk to you guys soon. Bye.